Welcome to the third installment of Damn It, Jim, the podcast. Tonight we're going to talk about Season 1, Episode 3, Where No Man Has Gone Before. I'm Dana Smith. Along with me is my co-host, Dan Calzaretta.
Hey, Dana, can you believe we're 3 episodes in and we've had no hate mail?
Yeah, well, it's early in the season yet, so give the fans a chance. Tonight, Dan, we've got what was really the second pilot filmed for Star Trek.
Dana, explain what that means, what a pilot is, in case there are people out there who don't know that, especially when we talk about television from the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s and 90s, pre-internet, pre-streaming. What was a pilot?
Well, a pilot was something that you showed to the executives of the TV station as a way of getting your show made. And the first episode was The Cage, actually, for Star Trek, with Christopher Pike, and Spock was in that. But the executives at NBC, when they saw it, weren't completely sold on it.
The comment they made, they said it was too cerebral.
Yeah.
Not enough punching and then shooting, apparently.
Well, Roddenberry had sold it as a wagon train to the stars.
Yeah.
They didn't want people in the show thinking too much. So that show was not picked up. And then, but they thought
the first pilot, is that?
Yeah, the first pilot, The Cage. So they decided to recast the show and rewrite the show for a second pilot because NBC said they thought there was something interesting there and that could evolve. They gave Roddenberry and his team a second chance, which I don't really think happens a whole lot in those types of things.
That's what I've read too, that actually it was NBC, I think at the time, had put in $633,000 into the first pilot and decided it was not going to fly. They asked Roddenberry for a second pilot.
The second pilot turned out to be Where No Man Has Gone Before. They've actually filmed 3 episodes up front, and Where No Man Has Gone Before was the very first one. William Shatner became Captain Kirk, as we all know, but he had competition. Jack Lord, who went on to play McGarrett 5-0.
Can you imagine him as, you know what, actually.
I could see it.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
Yeah.
I could really see him as the captain of the Enterprise. But who was the second guy?
Lloyd Bridges.
I'm not sure I can see that one.
I don't know. Did you ever watch Sea Hunt?
I did. Absolutely. He was underwater a lot. Not sure I could see him in space.
I could see the appeal, but anyways, they went with Shatner and they brought Spock back. They also brought in Gary Lockwood to play a main character in here. He's probably best known, you'd probably recognize him from 2001: A Space Odyssey. He was Dr. Frank Poole, one of the first on the space station to die. Doesn't he get locked in the airlock and then Hal just lets him go?
Yeah, just kind of ejects him out.
Yeah.
He's like tumbling into space.
That's a hell of a way to go.
Yeah.
But he was a veteran of TV series and some, more minor movies. Been around since the late 50s. And then on top of that, they had Sally Kellerman, who, again, was somebody that had been in several TV shows and had done some movies. Later on, I think it was 1971, she would portray Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan in the movie version of MASH. She just passed away recently, at age 84. It was actually this past February. And in 1973, she was also voted as the sex star, quote unquote, sex star by Playboy magazine. If only Star Trek had known that then, they probably would have put her on your favorite planet, Wrigley's Pleasure Planet. So.
Absolutely. Oh my. But that's something to consider, Dana.
I think we could ever produce a Star Trek show. It should be based around Wrigley's Pleasure Planet.
I think it should be. There would be some pretty amazing episodes there.
I'm pretty sure it'd be a hit.
Well, maybe J.J. Abrams will contact us and say, hey, guys.
What a great idea. Yeah.
I know you've been trying to get a hold of me, and let's do this.
So along with Sally Kellerman and Gary Lockwood, there was also another veteran actor playing the Doctor. It wasn't our friend Bones McCoy.
Yeah, DeForest Kelley.
It was Paul Fix, who was a veteran actor of Westerns mostly. He was the sheriff in The Rifleman. He shows up in a couple John Wayne movies, including The Sons of Katie Elder. He's he was just one of those guys that was just, you turn on TV or film from the 50s and early 60s, and Paul Fix was somewhere in the film.
So Dana, tell me, what is your thought about this? So we've established this early in the first 2 episodes of the podcast that we've done, that some of the characters that played in Star Trek had been in Westerns. What is the connection between this Western ideal of the United States and the frontier and Star Trek in the 23rd century?
Well, you just said it, the frontier. The West kind of had a certain limit. Somewhere, maybe it was Gene Roddenberry, thought, how do I expand this? How do I put it out so that it's limitless? And he looked up at this night sky, and again, I'm just guessing, and thought, the sky is endless. It's the final frontier.
But why don't we jump into the actual episode? Why don't you kind of start to walk us through what happens in this episode? What's the event that initiates the action?
So the Enterprise is approaching the edge of the galaxy, and they are saying that they've picked up a distress signal. And what it is a recorder. When they pull it in, they're talking about it. We see Scotty for the first time, who's at the transporter controls.
So they beam this thing aboard, the Enterprise.
Yeah.
I thought it looked like an air filter from a car. That's what I thought it looked like.
Yeah, with legs.
With legs, exactly.
Or an old-fashioned coffee maker. Yeah. So
could have been a coffee maker. Yes, exactly right.
They beam it aboard, and then the light goes off on it that's starting to percolate. We move forward, and Spock listens to the tapes. He talks about, they mention that they're doing research on ESP, that they encountered turbulence and some problems at the edge of the galaxy, and they started researching ESP. And then he mentions that it sounds like the captain gave the order to destroy the ship.
So this is the, what is it, the USS Valiant? And so we know that this device that has been beamed aboard, it's giving this information about what happened to the ship 200 years previous.
Then they decide they're going to go through the edge of the galaxy. And they encounter some turbulence. All of a sudden, the stations on board the ship start blowing up. Some fire erupts from the consoles. And then Sally Kellerman, who's standing on the bridge, gets zapped. Kind of gets a colorful outline to her body for a moment. And then Gary Lockwood, who's Gary Mitchell.
Gary Mitchell, yep.
He gets zapped, and he falls down. They make it through the edge of the galaxy, and then they determine, they check on Gary, and he's got silver glowing eyes.
Yeah, which was really interesting to me how they did that. I guess as it turns out, they actually had contact lenses that these actors had to wear that made their eyes look silver. And during the episode, when he has those contacts in, it just looks really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was immediately reminded of something I read years ago. I used to be a Hammer horror film fan, and you might remember Christopher Lee playing Dracula, and he for close-ups, they gave him these contacts that made his eyes, the pupil of his eyes, look black, and but they were like red, like he'd been out all night partying. But these were contacts, and he said he couldn't see very well through them. In one of the Dracula movies, where he's fighting Peter Cushing in the end, he said he kept stumbling over things because he couldn't see anything, because they just had basically like a pinhole for him to see through. And that's something that Gary Lockwood mentioned, is that these contacts were difficult to see through and only had like a pinhole. And he says that this affected his vision for the rest of his life.
So he thought that they actually damaged his vision.
Yeah. Star Trek, for all it's done for mankind going forward, might have hurt one of their characters. But anyway, these two crew members, Sally Kellerman, who's the ship's psychiatrist, and Mitchell, who was pilot, are affected and have these ESP powers. And Kirk has to decide between his friendship and the safety of the ship. And that's really what this whole episode comes down to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good point. And one thing I think that Star Trek does really well, they are able to create a story around friendship, around loyalty, and around like the greater good.
Kirk has called all the officers to the bridge to witness going to the edge of the galaxy or something. And so you've got the doctor, which is Paul Fix, and you've got Scotty. Sulu is, I think, a physicist, is how he's described.
That's exactly how he's described in the credits.
And then Sally Kellerman's introduced as a psychiatrist. She kind of walks down towards where Mitchell's sitting at the controls. They have a little exchange, and he turns to the helmsman and says, walking freezer unit.
Oh, Dana, I tell you, this was cringy. We've talked about in the first couple episodes the depiction of women in Star Trek, but this part was really disturbing to me.
And I was surprised the way he treated her, and you could tell that he was kind of a ladies' man. And when they start going through the edge of the galaxy, Kirk's yeoman, who he calls Jones, is actually Smith.
I love that part. He just didn't even know what her name was. Yeah.
She comes down, and while he's helping to navigate the ship, he's also reaching back and holding her hand.
Again, which implies that men are the powerful characters, a woman could not be a strong character. And this is a huge difference between this pilot and the original pilot. So in the original pilot, the character who was called Number One is female. Majel Barrett, I believe is her name.
Yeah.
Eventually ends up marrying Gene Roddenberry. But this is, again, when the network looked at that first pilot, they said, no, we can't do this. It's too cerebral. But you really have to ask yourself, was it was only because it was too cerebral, or was it also because we had these female characters who were strong, important, driving characters in the series, and they just couldn't deal with that?
Well, I have no doubt that all the executives at NBC were men at the time, and so I'm sure that they probably sat and laughed when they saw a woman really in second in command in the ship, and at times giving orders and trying to get things accomplished. Because the captain disappears and she's number one.
I totally agree. And then in this episode, kind of along the same lines, we also see that every female character in this episode is wearing long pants. No female character in those very short mini
dresses. Yeah,
exactly.
They take Gary Mitchell to sickbay. They report that 9 crewmen died during the event. And it's important to note, later it's discussed that all 9 crewmen that died had high ratings for ESP.
We're going to get into the dead crewman count in a bit, and we'll talk about this because it is kind of important. And there's a nice little trivia thing that happens with this.
So the only 2 survivors that were affected that have ESP were Mitchell and Denham, which Denham is Sally Kellerman. Mitchell gets put in sickbay, and Kirk goes to see him, and we find out that they're old buddies. But when Kirk comes in, Mitchell's laying on his side, and he doesn't even look and goes, "Hello, Jim."
Right.
Giving us, the insight that he's got something else going on there that he's able to see. And of course, he's got the silver eyes. They have a little conversation back and forth about their days in the academy. Mitchell says, I'm finally getting around to reading some of that long hair stuff that you used to push back at the academy.
Long hair. That's pretty interesting. So this goes to, I would say, culturally in the mid-1960s, we have a movement of the hippie movement, young people who are starting to resist the Vietnam War. I mean, it's early in that process, I would say, but it's still there.
I think long hair as an older reference, kind of thoughtful professors, people that wrote books on philosophy and, more artists. Part of that reference, I think, is kind of like the old masters. They go back and forth, have a little discussion, and then when Kirk's leaving, Mitchell says something like, "I told you should listen to me."
Yeah, it was that weird echoing thing that was happening, yeah. What I found was interesting about this encounter with Kirk and Mitchell, Kirk says to Mitchell, "I haven't been worried about you since that night on Deneb 4. And Mitchell says, "Yeah, she was a nova, that one. Not nearly as many after effects as this time." The implication to me is that there was some type of, I don't know, sexually transmitted infection happening. I mean, I think that's very clear to me. There is no other way, in in my mind to read that.
Maybe I'm just more of a romantic. I was thinking it meant like it hurt his heart that he didn't recover fast. But
Oh, I didn't get that at all, Dana.
yeah, no, you're probably more right. But I was trying to go to a better place. So, yeah.
But what's interesting to me, though, this is the third episode we've watched, right?
Yes.
But this is the second pilot. This is what sold the network on Star Trek. And we see a couple of things here that are pretty fascinating to me. Let me break them down. One is how males are treating females in the 23rd century. Not any different from the 1960s,
Yeah.
right? Zero difference.
Yep.
The second is this sexual overtones that are in all three episodes. I mean, we've seen it in Charlie X. No question in my mind,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's pretty specific as they talk about the pleasure planets and so on. We saw it in the first episode with very specifically with, the male characters seeing the female monster in different ways that reflected their own version of what the ideal woman was. In this pilot, which again was filmed before those other two episodes, we see this underlying and pretty blatant, actually, sexism of the male characters toward the female characters and of the writers toward like women in general.
Yeah, I agree. I think sex sells. And I'm sure they thought, okay, it's not just a wagon train of a bunch of dudes. Instead of brothels, we can create whole planets.
In this episode, Dana, it is noted that of the 428 crewmen on the ship, which we learned in the last episode, that there are about 100 females on this ship.
Not great odds for the women. To get back to the storyline here, when Kirk goes back to the bridge and talks to Spock, Spock is kind of spying on Gary Mitchell. And you see Mitchell is like reading, like he went through the Evelyn Woods course in a day.
You got to explain that to people because you understand it and I understand it, but I'm not sure most people would understand it.
Doesn't everybody remember the Evelyn Woods speed reading courses?
Yeah, only if you were born in like the 60s, maybe.
The books he's reading are on the monitor, which are connected to these cards, almost like a 3.5-inch floppy disk. My guess would be it'd be like a 2x3 disc that they were putting in. So again, Star Trek way ahead of its time. He is just flying through these, and Spock turns to Kirk and says, "Is this the Gary Mitchell that you know?"
Is that Gary Mitchell? The one you used to know? Put a 24-hour watch in the sick bay. Fullest possible range of examinations and tests.
Because they're spying on him from the bridge, essentially, right?
Yeah.
They're looking into sick bay. They can see him flying through all this data that he's reading from the ship's library.
Denner enters the sick bay. There's a immediate kind of a liking between the two of them. There's some kind of sexual tension going on between Denner and Mitchell.
Yep, it's a hot Lips Houlihan kind of situation.
Yeah. And he's not Frank Burns. They're talking about his comprehension of the reading, and she says,
Do you remember everything you read that quickly?
Yeah,
On any tape?
sure.
Page 387.
My love has wings, slender feathered things with grace and upswept curve and tapered tip. Nightingale woman.
And it turns out to be a love poem, and which actually turns out to have been something written by Roddenberry for his plane when he was in the service.
Yeah, I read about that. So he was a pilot in World War II, and he wrote a poem. The lines were something like, "My love has wings, slender feathered things." And that's about all they say in the show. I took at least an hour, maybe two, trying to search this, and I think the entire poem is kind of lost to history.
So anyway, we see that they're developing a relationship. There's kind of an intensity between the two of them. They get interrupted by crewman Kelso, who's like the ship's navigator, and they're old friends apparently. He sees what's going on and kind of acts like, oh, here's Gary again. Mitchell tells him to check the starboard impulse engines and says the pack points are ready to collapse. And when Kelso doubts him, Mitchell yells at him and says, "You better check them." We change to the next scene where there's a conference room, and Kelso's has this thing that looks like kind of a shock absorber.
It did. Yeah, exactly.
And he calls it the points, and he says, "I don't know how he missed this, but the points are bad." Sulu's in the room, Scotty, Spock, Kirk, and of course Dr. Piper all around the room. And Denner enters, and Spock is saying that Mitchell is mutating, and Denner says something like, "So what's wrong if he's like a superhuman being with ESP?
Right.
Maybe that'd be good for mankind."
Has he shown abilities of such magnitude?
I saw some such indications.
And you didn't think it worth mentioning?
No one's been hurt, have they? Don't you understand? A mutated superior man could also be a wonderful thing. The forerunner of a new and better kind of human being.
So we've got this conference that's happening in the conference room, right?
Yeah, the meeting of the minds. Denner argues that no one has been hurt. Kirk asks Sulu his opinion, and Sulu says that the rate that Mitchell is progressing is geometrically. And it says something about as if you were to give somebody a penny a day, and in a month's time, they'd be a millionaire.
So if I were to give you a penny today, Dana, and you double...
Are we going to do math? I'm
telling you, for our listeners, do this. Just do this calculation. I give you a penny today. Double it tomorrow. How many pennies do you have?
2.
Great. That's really...
Whew.
You pass. Okay. Double it again the next day.
4.
All right. You go out 30 days, you will be a millionaire. Now, I know that sounds impossible. You will be a millionaire by the end of the month. And that's exactly what Sulu is saying.
I've got a lot of pennies.
Well, you got to double them, though, Dana.
So after Sulu gives us a math lesson, Spock says that Mitchell has attained power that we cannot cope with, and soon we will just be an annoyance to him.
This concept of a superior intellectual being seeing humans as an annoyance is one that we encounter in science fiction since the 60s, but maybe even before that.
You think about some of the sci-fi movies of the 50s and stuff, along with, the atomic radiation that made them grow 50 feet tall or, mutate. One of the things that would happen is if somebody gained superpowers, they saw everybody else as insects. Everybody leaves the room, and we have Kirk and Spock. Spock kind of comes back to Kirk and says, "You've got 2 choices."
Well, I need a recommendation, Spock, not vague warning.
Recommendation 1. There's a planet a few light days away from here, Delta Vega. It has a lithium cracking station. We may be able to adapt some of its power packs to our engines.
And if we can't, we'll be trapped in orbit there. We haven't enough power to blast back out.
It is the only possible way to get Mitchell off this ship.
If you mean strand Mitchell there, I won't do it.
Then you have one other choice. Kill Mitchell while you still can.
Kirk gets on the intercom and says, "Set a course for Delta Vega." We get to Delta Vega. It's slightly smaller than Earth, full of minerals and crystals. Mitchell, of course, since he has super ESP, is aware of their plans. And he even says, "If I was you, I was in your shoes, I would kill me."
Yeah, which I found fascinating, that interaction with Kirk to say that, you need to do what Spock's telling you to do.
Yeah, and so Kirk and Spock advance on him, and he knocks them down. He starts talking about Delta Vega won't do for him. He needs to find another planet, something like what a god could use. And that to me is, and I think Kirk and Spock got it for sure then, that they were in trouble. They jump him, pin him down, and Denner actually gives him a sedative to knock him out.
So when I watched this scene, all I could think about was the scene in Young Frankenstein.
Sedative.
Because she almost jabs Kirk in the arm with this thing. It's the sedative. And then they take him to the transporter room, don't they?
Dr. Piper's there. Mitchell starts waking up, and he says, "I will crush you all like insects." That's a bad sign. Piper gives him another sedative, knocks him out, and they put him on the transporters and transport down to Delta Vega.
So I got a problem with this whole scene, I got to tell you. So they give him a sedative, right? Which would knock a horse over.
It's a long shot. He gives it's like...
I know, it goes on for a while. And then they stick him on the transporter, and then they let go. So he's just on his own little transporter pad, and he doesn't fall over. Are you kidding me? Come on. The dude would fall over. And so he transports down to the planet, and then as soon as they transport down, they like grab him before he falls down.
Couldn't you see if he had fallen off the transporter pad, they all transfer down, and then he's on the ship. He's got control of the ship.
Or only like half of him transports down. I'm not sure which would be better, the upper half or the lower half. Somehow he stands up through the whole freaking transporter thing, which I don't buy at all. And they get him to the planet, and they catch him before he falls down.
But I want to say Delta Vega, the backdrop that they use, pretty impressive. I really liked it. Looked like some kind of refueling, maintenance station, something very kind of sparse. And I thought they did a really good job with that. So,
yeah, I mean, you figure this is 1965 when they're filming it, and it does look pretty cool.
Fortunately, Delta Vega has a jail cell with a force field. It's completely unmanned, but just in case you happen to be passing by with somebody that needs to be in a jail cell, they've got a jail cell with a force field. They've got him in this jail cell, and he tries to get through the force field. It zaps him, another special effect there, and at one point falls down, and his eyes clear up. Kirk right away was, Gary. He's like all excited that his friend is back. Right after saying that, he turns back with the silver eyes and starts making not so idle threats. Kelso is down on the planet. Kirk asks Kelso to set up a button that if he needed to, he could remotely destroy the planet.
Well, so Kelso's down there, right? And he's got to set up this switch, and he's got to be the guy that flips the switch. So are you going to get beamed up? Are you just going down with the, with the whole explosion thing? They don't really explain that, but he does set up this switch so that he can flip it, and then I assume they beam him up.
And he says, if he gets free, you have to flip the switch. Something to that effect. So it sounds to me like a suicide mission.
And the actor's probably like, gosh darn it, I was hoping to be a regular on this series.
Kirk is talking to Scotty, and Scotty says something about, did you get the laser rifle I beamed down? And he's like, I didn't ask for it. And then Spock comes walking around with this laser rifle, and Spock pulls Kirk aside and says, in my opinion, we'll be lucky to repair the ship and get away in time.
Hey, Dana, we're running up against the clock here. So we're going to continue this episode next week. So please tune in for part 2 of our episode on Where No Man Has Gone Before. We would love to hear your thoughts, comments, and suggestions. You can reach us at dammit.jimpodcast@gmail.com. That's DAMNIT jimpodcast@gmail.com. You can also join the discussion on Facebook and Twitter. Until next week, for Dan and Dana, live long and prosper.
You're listening to Damn It, Jim, the podcast. This is the second part of Where No Man Has Gone Before. Joining me, Dan Calzaretta. I'm Dana Smith.
Hey, Dana, this is great that we've got our first 2-part episode, and we're only 3 episodes into our season.
I'm sure some people are shuddering at the thought that we're going to get longer and longer with each one. But, So back at the jail cell, there's Spock and Denner. Denner is watching Mitchell like he's a pork chop and she hasn't eaten in 2 weeks. It's just,
yeah, that's right, man.
She has just got this look on her face. I'm going to devour that as soon as everybody's gone. And Kirk says, we're getting everybody off the planet. Denner, between drooling at Mitchell, says she wants to stay behind. Of course, Kirk's like, no, you can't. You've got to come with us. We're going to leave him here. After she says she's staying behind, Kelso is talking to Scotty and saying that everything's rigged. He's got everything set to go. And all of a sudden, this cable comes up that's being controlled by Mitchell. We can guess, and it strangles him.
Yeah, like that dude is not going to be in any future episodes.
So he gets killed. So add another one to the dead crewman list.
Yep, we'll get to that. We'll get to the whole count by the end of the episode here.
And then Mitchell breaks through the force field and knocks out Kirk and Spock. And then he talks to Denner and something about, how great it is to feel this way and all this stuff. And he brings her into his cell and they look into the one mirror that's in there because it's only made for one person, remember? And she has silver eyes now. This godlike character has found his mate.
And who knows what else goes on in that cell?
Dr. Piper tells Kirk that Kelso is dead and that Denner and Mitchell have fled. Kirk tells the doctor not to wake up Spock, to get everyone off the planet. It's his fault that Mitchell got away as he did. If you don't receive word from me, proceed at maximum warp to nearest Earth base. When you come back to the planet should be hit with a lethal dose of neutron radiation. So then we go out to the desert. Mitchell and Denner are walking along. Mitchell basically turns the wasteland into a garden. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of see he's like thrilled with himself that he can do this. We see Kirk's approaching with the phaser rifle.
And can I say that this is the only episode of Star Trek, all 3 seasons, where the phaser rifle makes an appearance. There is no other phaser rifle appearance in any episode of Star Trek.
I read that. I was dubious about that. I was trying to rack my brains and think if there was another scene, but I think you're right. I think that's true.
In the cage, there is a phaser cannon, but that was again before this episode happened.
Mitchell and Denner sense Kirk's approaching. Mitchell's voice is now stronger and echoes all the time. And he sends Denner out to meet Kirk and says, go and see how insignificant they are. She goes out and tries to tell Kirk to leave. Of course, Kirk argues with her, and he tries to convince Denner to help him. Be a psychiatrist for just a moment longer to see what Mitchell has really become. And so then, of course, Mitchell couldn't stay out of it. He shows up. Kirk does a dive and roll with the phaser rifle and fires at Mitchell with no effect. It just kind of bounces off of him.
Right. And then Mitchell does some kind of psychic thing and makes the laser rifle fly away. And I watched that a couple of times. You can see the wires attached to the laser rifle. Yeah, the special effects were not like they are now.
And then Mitchell says, I've been contemplating the death of an old friend. Points at the ground, and there's a hole there like a grave. And then a moment later, he creates a tombstone, and the tombstone reads, and this is a trivia question, James R. Kirk.
Yep, and further it reads 012771 to 18187. So I imagine those are star dates. So why is that significant, Dana, the James R. Kirk?
Well, because later on, he's referred to as James T. Kirk, and we find out later it's the T stands for Tiberius.
Yeah, in fact, I was doing some research into that. What I found was that the first time that we learn that the T stands for Tiberius is in the animated series, which came after.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which came after Star Trek, the original series. But the first time we hear it in a live version of the show is in Star Trek 6. So it takes quite a while.
Oh, wow. I was not aware of that. Every time I tune into this show, I learn something. So
that's right. Exactly right.
Mitchell kind of tries to get some of the rocks to tumble onto Kirk, and he forces Kirk into a prayer position and says, kneel to your God.
Time to pray, Captain. Pray to me.
Kirk makes a comment. We discussed this last week with Charlie X about absolute power corrupting absolutely. I think it's something we'll see in several of the episodes. Denner all of a sudden sees what's going on. Kirk makes a reference about pretty soon there will only be one of you. Denner comes to her senses somewhat, and so she zaps Mitchell, and then they kind of go back and forth pointing their hands at each other and zapping one another.
I thought that was really funny, though, the kind of the pointing the hands and the wiggling of the fingers. And this was a little ridiculous.
Mitchell falls, and Denner says, now's your chance. Act fast. This won't last for long. And so Kirk goes after him, and here's the obligatory fight scene.
Yeah.
A lot of punches, some tackling. Kirk jumps up and kicks him a couple times, and then Kirk knocks him down and picks up a rock, and is about ready to smash Gary Mitchell. And he says, "Please forgive me." And then Mitchell's eyes turn silver, and he says, "The moment is fading," and throws Kirk off of him. The fight continues for a minute. Mitchell gets knocked down into the grave. Kirk grabs the phaser rifle, and shoots at the rocks overhead, and they tumble in, killing and burying Gary Mitchell.
But in this scene also, we see that this idea of you got to have a fight scene, you got to have some punching, you have to have some blood, you have to have a ripped shirt. We can see that all those things happen in this scene, don't we?
Exactly. And there is one thing I noticed is that Kirk really argues philosophically, not only with Denner, but also with Mitchell, and shows his intelligence. It is a bit cerebral, but he's not afraid to use his fists.
And I think that's what sold the network on the show.
I agree. I think it had a little bit of everything, a little sex appeal, and some good old-fashioned violence.
And we'll see moving forward that those things are just amplified, right? I mean, in this episode, we see a little bit of fist fighting. We do see female characters in the show, but none of them have short skirts on. And so we're going to see that idea of sexualization of female characters. We're going to see the kind of hyper-masculine side of certainly Kirk, and that's what seems to propel the show. Yeah,
you can only imagine that the NBC executives sitting in a room watching this said, what would make this show better? Is if we had a bunch of women walking around in like mini dresses. Again, I'm sure that somebody said, this has got just about everything. All we need is women in short dresses.
That's right.
That's basically what it came down to. And when they thought about it, they said, this is the future. It's not the Wild West where women wore petticoats and stuff. This is the future, and people can wear whatever we want them to wear. We could have people walking around in a thong.
Okay, so of all the characters in Star Trek in a thong, I'm thinking Spock probably could have carried it, right? He probably could have carried the thong. He'd be like, fascinating. The feel that I get while wearing a thong is interesting.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. All right, let's move beyond that.
Denner dies as well. Before she dies, she apologizes and says to Kirk, "You can't know what it's like to almost be a god." Back on the Enterprise, Kirk puts Denner and Mitchell in for commendations for dying in the line of duty.
Add to official losses, Dr. Elizabeth Dana. Be it noted she gave her life in performance of her duty. Lieutenant Commander Gary Mitchell. Same notation.
And he tells Spock it wasn't their fault that this happened to them, especially with Mitchell. He says he didn't ask for this. Spock comments that he felt for Mitchell too.
He didn't ask for what happened to him.
I felt for him too.
I believe there's some hope for you after all, Mr. Spock.
And that's how the show ends.
We get a little bit of an idea what Spock is like, right? He's this alien being, half human. We understand that his and Kirk's relationship probably predates the episode, like friendship or some connection there. And we also, I think, learn that Spock is going to play this non-emotional, more intellectual role, or kind of a foil to Kirk's impulsivity, his very human nature.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think that's how they tried to set it up. The two of them were going to be interacting throughout and would be essential to the show.
Not only essential, but I would say the core relationship.
as McCoy came along, he added into that because he kind of has jibes with Spock. They have conversations. So it becomes the three of them really are the core.
Well, let's go back just a little bit to maybe the core dilemma. I'd like to propose that it is what happens when humans think they can play God. And if you think about it, in the 1960s, maybe there wasn't a whole lot of science around genomes and the sequencing of the human genome. But as you move into the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, we can see that humans are starting to play with the building blocks of nature, including human nature. But it seems to me that this is really where the show was going. How do we deal with humans thinking that they're God?
I think that's something that was a warning for all of us going forward. We'll see this time and again where absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And not a new concept, really. I mean, if you look at even going back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, playing God is not a new concept at all.
Oh, no. We'll see this time and time again in the Star Trek universe.
Let's talk about some other interesting trivia. So on the 5th day of filming of this episode, there were bees that attacked the set that both Shatner and Kellerman were occupying at the time, and they both got stung.
And we see that Spock looks more like he did in the original pilot. His eyebrows are more like a V, not quite as bushy as they were in the first episode. His hair is now combed forward, where in the pilot episode, he kind of had it pushed to one side.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing, too, is in this episode, he does a lot of yelling, not as unemotional as he will become. Do you have a favorite quote you want to talk about?
Kirk says when he's talking to Denner, says that God needs compassion.
One of my favorite was Mitchell says to Kirk, command and compassion is a fool's mixture. So really it begs the question, like, as a leader, is it better to be loved or feared? What do you think?
I've been a supervisor and manager. I've always found it was better if people at least liked me. I never expected them to love me. I learned early on that those people that I feared as managers, I didn't want to do anything for them. If you're doing things because you really like your boss, I think that goes a lot further. You can get a lot more out of people by getting them to be on your side.
Hey, we need to talk about our dead crewman count.
So we had 9 just crossing the edge of the galaxy.
Right, that's not a good place to be if you're
Kelso, so that's 10. And then we have, of course, Mitchell and Denner.
Yep, so we have 12 this episode, is that correct?
That's what I've got.
And we have a total of 16. That's in 3 episodes. So that's a little more than 5, an average of 5 per episode.
This is the most crewmen that died in any episode.
To be honest, is a little disappointing to me, Dana. I'm a little disappointed that that's the case.
There are several moments in this episode that kind of made me say, what the heck was that? One of the first ones was Kirk wanted the officer group on the bridge, and I mentioned this earlier as they left the galaxy. So he's got the doctor, he's got Scotty, he's got and of course the doctor brought along the psychiatrist, and Sulu's there. But they're all standing together real close, like they're posing for a picture. It just was odd.
This has been great talking about this episode. It's been a 2-parter. We will be off next week for the 4th of July holiday, which I'm assuming in the future happens, like Kirk talks about Thanksgiving in the future.
I'll have to pay attention to that. I'm sure that they mention holidays. Because they do shore leave a couple times, and so maybe somebody's celebrating 4th of July.
Well, we got Thanksgiving, right, in Charlie X. So the next episode we're going to do is The Naked Time. And interestingly, we get to see Hikaru Sulu without a shirt. Yeah, so we've already seen Kirk without a shirt. Now we get to see Sulu without a shirt. I don't think we're going to ever see Yeoman Rand or Uhura without a shirt. Just my guess. All right, Dana. It's been a great couple of episodes.
As I mentioned, I continue to learn as I go forward with this, even in our conversations, things you bring up that I missed. And hopefully I can add something to this that you didn't see or you weren't thinking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks once again for joining us for part 2 of Where No Man Has Gone Before. We would love to hear from you. Please email us at dammitjimpodcast@gmail.com. That's DAMNIT jimpodcast@gmail.com. Or join the discussion on Facebook or Twitter. Remember, next week we are off for the 4th of July holiday. In 2 weeks, join us for The Naked Time. For Dan and Dana, live long and prosper.